Will you start by taking us through the current situation in Kupyansk and the significance of the Russian advances that we're seeing there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually true. There are only 60 Russians in Kupansk. However, they are all literal supermen who have in each hand, killed hundreds of Ukrainians each, fighting for the Kiev regime. So yeah, I mean, this Zelensky, this they're so far detached from reality. And there was a point where I thought it was propaganda, but at this point, I think Zelensky is literally bat feces insane. He's just been broken, mentally, emotionally, whatever. He's broken, and he's living in his own fantasy world, a lot like Trump. I mean, Trump lives in his own fantasy world where he has conversations with Modi, with Modi telling him what he wanted to hear, that according to Modi never happened, and so forth and so on. So in Trump world, he stopped 8 wars and brought peace to the world, and so forth. So I see a certain similitude in this. And the European elite are likewise, seemingly in a world that is just devoid from the real world, that at least in Ukraine right now is about mud and blood and steel, that the rest of us inhabit, although not necessarily with the mud and blood and steel. That's reserved for the contact line. Yeah, Kupansk is an important logistical center. Russia took it early in the conflict. Like just rolled in the initial days, but they were forced to withdraw in autumn of 2022 out of the Kharkov region. It's in the southern Kharkov region, because the Kiev regime had spent the whole time of the Istanbul peace process to conscript forces and to get NATO weapon supplies, and for whatever reason, the Russian government seemed to believe that the Kiev regime was serious about the Istanbul process. I don't know why they did, but anyway, then they said, "Psych, Minsk 3," right? And the Russian forces were caught with their pants down. They had begun the war with only 150,000 troops in the SMO, very smaller than the Kiev regime standing active duty military at the time. And they had not been mobilizing troops. So they had far more territory at that point, when the Istanbul peace process, the fig leaf of it was tossed aside. The Kiev regime had a quote unquote million-man army on paper, and then NATO Western weapons out the Yahoo. And Russia was forced to retreat while they began a short mobilization of reservists, but then also began a big volunteer contract soldier campaign, and began to settle in for a long war of attrition. Part of that was the withdrawal from Kupyansk. Now, Kupansk has been an important, in the Kiev regime's operational rear, logistics and supply center. It's a junction of railroads and highways and others, a lot like Pokrovsk in the South Donbass. This provides supplies for the northern Donbass area through this area. And Kupansk and Liman together, where Russian forces are also fighting in Liman, together that allows Izium, and Izium is the gateway to Slavyansk, and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are the last defensive line of the Kiev regime in Ukraine. So by taking Kupansk now and Liman, that will assure that come spring, all that the Kiev regime will have left in their hands is Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and that will be wrapped up theoretically by no later than the summer. So it's all, dominoes falling in. Kupyansk is divided in two. It's not quite even two, but two by the Oskol River, which cuts right through it. And Russia definitively controls the east side. If we're talking total territory in Kupansk, that is controlled by Russia. It's around somewhere between 50 and 60% from the reliable sources that I've heard from on this. The Kiev regime reliably controls about 20%, and the rest is in the gray zone. That's the situation right now, and the Kiev is holding out in a part of the industrial zone of the city, and of course they are still holding part of the residential area, the high-rise buildings, the type of buildings, the Soviet construction that are referred to as citadels, because with all the people moved out of them and the troops moved in, that's essentially what they are. Except I've seen video just from today of a Russian Fab glide bomb hitting one of those citadels, and poof, and that's it. Fab. There's no more citadel, and there's no more troops defending it. It's The Russian glide bombs are having a devastating uh, effect on the Kiev regime's ability to hold territory. Now, it does also destroy completely whatever is being targeted, but Russia is willing to do that and rebuild afterwards at this point, particularly when it comes to an important, time sensitive, according to their own schedule of taking Kupyansk. Um, and this is the Kiev regime has all kinds of nonsense that they're in control of the situation and they've already won the Battle of Kupyansk. And I mean, I eventually this they're not going to be able to lie anymore. I think in Pokrovsk, the situation has already been then, and the only reason it hasn't in Kupyansk is because it attracts slightly less of the Western mainstream media attention, perhaps because of its relatively. The Kharkov region is not a hotbed of focus, even though this is the part of the Kharkov region that is essentially part of the Donbass theater. So I really, it's a matter of days. It's not any more than that. The Kiev regime cannot get supplies in, while it is not a full physical encirclement yet. All their supply lines are cut. Russians have either physical control or very thorough drone and artillery operational control of any supply lines. You can't get things in, you can't get wounded or retreat out. Kupansk is really only days behind Pokrovsk. In fact, it was looking like there was a kind of a race to see which one, and Pokrovsk just managed to break past that finish line first. Pokrovsk is already in Russian hands. The fact that the Kiev regime might still, hold basements in the odd building here or there that they need to be cleared out of, there is no organized resistance left. There is one street of Pokrovsk that is under Kiev regime control at this point. Um, the rest is not. There was rather dramatic videos of Pokrovsk coming out today. One of the things that's happening on the battlefield is the environmental, right, the meteorological conditions, right. First, this is the mud season, the Rasputitsa. And there has been a lot of mud, a lot of rain. Now, it's not a big a deal when you're already into an urban environment, right? So that has less effect. And the Russian forces have not been using big vehicle charges, and certainly not as much as they used to in the conflict, simply because of drones and the dynamics that have changed. It just doesn't make, usually a lot of logistical sense. The Kiev regime, meanwhile, has lost vehicles that they did not have left to spare back in Kupansk, throwing and throwing and throwing, try to break open that encirclement. And by all reports, they were throwing more vehicles trying to break the encirclement in Kupansk, and I assume in Pokrovsk, to the north, just to the north of Pokrovsk and Rodinskaya as well, that they just didn't have. They've lost more vehicles in the past week or so than they have in a couple of months. And it's out of desperation, not because it's practical to do so, but it has just hastened their attrition. Right? They come out of defenses and go on the counterattack later than they should have to try to break the encirclement, because they didn't retreat the forces out of these places when they could have done so in good order and established a new, better, secure defensive line. It's all, they do this again and again and again, and they never learn their lesson. And it's, of course, all political rather than military. But I mean, that has been the hallmark of the Kiev regime. But back to the meteorological conditions. Other than the mud, it's fog. There is crazy thick. You've probably seen Stephen King's The Mist. I mean, that's what it looks like. It's crazy, and that really affects things on the battlefield. Drones don't do much good. The ubiquitous drones really don't fly. The birds don't fly when there's fog like this. In fact, it also reduces, obviously the effects of Russia's air superiority and artillery as well. Right? You can't use that. On the other hand, it's much easier to move troops around. And in this case, Russia has already held 95% plus of Pokrovsk, and but this was done through their infiltration tactics with infantry, right? Moving in 2, 3 at a time, right, to avoid drone attention and so forth, and then only forming a critical mass once they're behind the lines. That's the infiltration tactics that Russia has settled on. But now with this fog, what it has allowed is Russia to just roll the vehicles into the territory in Pokrovsk that they already control. And there's these surreal videos of just convoys of Russian vehicles, of trucks, of motorcycles, of guys on foot through this thick mist. It's surreal. It looks like something out of some super, sci-fi or supernatural Stephen King The Mist, episode. At the same time, if the Kiev regime forces were to have any hope of fleeing through fields in the middle of the night to try to get out of the encirclement, thick fog like this gives them a higher chance than they would have otherwise of escaping, because even with thermal imaging and everything, the drones just aren't flying in thick fog like this. So both sides can theoretically take advantage of it to some degree or not, and it also inhibits them to one degree or another. It's just something that you have to take into account. But I have rarely seen fog this thick, so it is a quite unusual situation that is just adding a whole surreal nature to the fall of Pokrovsk and Kupyansk right now, creating some very unique video and pics of the end of these two sieges.
Wow, that is really interesting. And I don't see a lot of discussion about that because I know that there has been a lot of talk and it feels like the NAFO trolls are out more than ever before. They definitely got some funding somewhere, but out on social media claiming like, oh, Pokrovsk will never fall, right? Kupyansk will never fall. And I'm like, okay, I mean, you can think that if you want, that does not line up with
Yeah,
reality
I
and what
remember
we're
them saying
seeing.
that about Mariupol back at the beginning of the conflict, and everything that has fallen since then. So
Yeah, it's really the battle of the moment. But one thing that I did notice, because we're starting to see media in the West admit that things are not good for Kiev, that they're likely, right, there as they say it, they're likely to to lose Pokrovsk, as you're noting. They've essentially already lost it. But then they're taking it a step further and they're saying, oh, well, Pokrovsk isn't really that meaningful, right? Not that much left. This isn't that big of a quote unquote win for Russia. We don't even know why they're doing this at this point. So, will you take us through kind of the significance of Pokrovsk? Because I know that this is an area that Russia has been fighting for a while now. And when it comes to the overall liberation of the Donetsk region, kind of where Pokrovsk stands in that overall line.
Yeah, that's really amusing because the Western mainstream media has spent the last couple of months telling us how vital the defense of Pokrovsk was. But of course, now that it's falling, they have to 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 huff a big copium dose, right? To completely change the narrative on this. Pokrovsk it was extremely important, and it will be extremely important. It formed a very important transport and logistics hub in the Kiev regime's operational rear. Then it was the tactical rear. Then it was the front line. Very soon it will be in Russia's tactical rear. And it will form a very important transport and logistics hub for Russia in a very short period of time. By taking Pokrovsk, they are completely connecting now and bringing under Russian control the railroad network in the Donbass. Russia has controlled parts of it, but now by they're linking, taking Pokrovsk will link everything together through a kind of circuit through the Donbass that the railroad network, if you take a look at a map, follows through. So that will bring the entire open up the entire railroad network to not just controlled by Russia, but active use, right? At the same time, the Kiev regime has stopped trains running now to that top of the last defensive line that we're moving towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk because they don't have control of this section anymore. So they've ended that. Everything now going into Slavyansk and Kramatorsk has to come in by road. Railroads, the preferred, much easier and more cost effective uh, way of moving anything military around is no longer an option for the Kiev regime in the Donbass, and that's big. It means that they're losing it. At the same time, Pokrovsk, if you take a look, people seem to think, particularly in the West, that geography is not important. And their inability to find anything on a map anywhere in the world is a case of that. But if you take a look at a topographical map of Ukraine, you can see that Pokrovsk is the high ground. Everything to the west of Pokrovsk is lowland, all the way to in a kind of a big valley flat into the steppe, and all the way to Pavlograd and the banks of the Dnieper River. And there's no big urban settlements, no constant urban agglomerations like in the Donbass. There's no hills, there's no mines, there's no big factories, there's nothing. It's steppe all the way to Pavlograd. That is operational space. And Russia's the only thing that's going to inhibit them there is how fast their logistics can keep up with the troops moving, right? They're just going to roll into Dnipropetrovsk from that direction, like they're already doing a little bit further to the south. So that's big, but it also is going to enable them to move on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, because Slavyansk and Kramatorsk also, further to the north, are in a lowland area. And by moving into Kupyansk and Liman, taking the heights from the north, Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar takes the heights to the east of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and it's all just going to be downhill, right? Which makes the defense of those last fortress cities, extremely difficult. So the topography and the geography of these places really do matter, and if it wasn't for the transport and logistics, even that alone would be immense strategic significance. But you add it all together, yeah, this is a big strategic. And of course, they continually talk territory. Like, this is Russia's biggest territorial gain since they completely either don't understand or refuse to understand this conflict, because Russia is not yet fighting a war of territorial conquest. They're fighting a war of attrition. And the point is to destroy the enemy. After that, then they can just roll over the territory. That's the Clausewitzian way that the Russian military strategy works, and the Western media still hasn't gotten. Far more important than just the territorial is the fact that the Kiev regime is simply not capable of holding this territory anymore or anywhere else, because they've had to take troops from all over the contact line to try to hold, and then strip them even more for these fruitless counterattacks, to try to free up the forces that they left sit there too long. And meanwhile, in eastern Zaporozhye, Russian forces are just going two, three settlements a day at this point, moving, circling. Right, we're going to have Slavyansk. I'm sorry, Pokrovsk and Kupyansk now, right, in the next 2 weeks. And immediately following that, you're going to have Konstantinovka and Liman and Seversk. And by then, Gulai Polya in southern Zaporozhye, or eastern Zaporozhye, will be encircled as well, because Russian forces are just moving like that on it. And it's all, they just can't hold anything anymore. Before, they could only hold and slow down Russian forces in certain areas, but they could slow them down. They could defend some areas by stripping others. That has been the story of the conflict this year. Now they can't even stop or slow down Russian forces anywhere. It's not they can't do it everywhere. They can't do it anywhere now.
Wow, that's gotta be the big lesson out of all of this. And I know that the media won't admit that they're wrong, right? The politicians won't admit that they're wrong, but they do kind of make that jump between, oh, Prokrovsk is so important, we have to hold it, to, oh, it's not that big of a deal anyway, right? It is the copium that you were talking about there.
What's that? Oh, that's Baghdad Bob behind them, blushing, blushing.
Exactly. And now you also have, I did want to bring up kind of the diplomatic games involved in all of this, because I know that's something we've been covering along the way. You've got Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying he's ready to meet with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, noting the importance of keeping a line of communication open between Russia and the US. And I'm curious how much of this is, obviously, to a certain extent, Russia is playing the game, saying, hey, you want to talk? We'll talk. I'm also curious how much what's happening on the battlefield then gets translated into these talks. If there's a point where Russia's like, are you sure you don't want to make a deal now? Or if they just kind of keep the wagon rolling, so to speak. Let's not worry about what's happening on the battlefield. Let's talk over here, kind of keep the US distracted until all of a sudden there's no Kiev regime left to really debate over anymore. How do you see the talks, the promise of talks that are happening, and are they having any effect, or rather, are they being affected by what's happening on the battlefield?
I mean, Lavrov can say that he's willing to meet with Rubio. I don't really see the point. I mean, why? I just, I don't. It was the U.S. who arranged talks in Budapest and then canceled them. So, I mean, it's not on Russia at this point. And, they can look over every once in a while, to the United States. Another city falls, another city falls. The Kiev, another 20,000 Kiev regime troops desert just in October, and they can look over, look over the game board and in the direction of the U.S. and say, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" And the U.S. isn't going to be done. So, I mean, eventually, I imagine that the Kremlin will get tired of it, but they evidently haven't yet. Although sometimes I think that they're simply going through the motions of signaling that they are open to diplomacy when they know full well that the West isn't, or is simply incapable, right? I don't know what goes through Trump's mind any given 15 minutes. I don't think it's important, because ultimately he doesn't have the ability to surrender Ukraine. He doesn't have that power, right? The US deep state, the blob, the institutions of the US government have that power, and he just can't make decisions like that. So they're not willing to do that. They will fight this conflict to the last Ukrainian and beyond. if only because they falsely believe that it's making Russia pay a high cost. And not somehow they're not seeing that they're literally destroying Europe in the process, but that's their ally. So what it is there, I don't see any hope of diplomatic settlement here. I don't think that the Trump administration is really deal or diplomacy capable. Except when they're in a position of strength, of blackmail, of this mafia style, Trumpian tactics of dictating to other countries, and as he himself boasted that other countries are coming to quote the US president, kiss my ass, right? And that's the way he likes it, right? That's where he's comfortable, right? In a heated peer-peer um, diplomatic situation where he doesn't have any leverage with either Putin or Xi Jinping, he's much less comfortable. That's perfectly obvious, and doing everything to avoid those situations, or trying to walk out of that. Even though he's been knocked to the mat, bloodied, he gets up and raises his fists up like he's won some kind of victory. I mean, that's Trump. Trump never loses in Trump world. But I don't see any possibility of diplomatic settlement. Even if Trump, for a 15-minute period of time, was committed to it, which I don't think is important, the rest of his administration is not. The rest of the U.S. deep state is not. The European political elite is not. The Kiev regime is not. It doesn't make any difference. So Trump is almost irrelevant in this scenario. This has been written. It's you're not going to get off of this script. You have to follow this script to its inevitable Shakespearean, tragic, and bloody end. And we're talking some of the bloodier, tragicer of Shakespeare. We're not talking a Midnight Summer's Dream here.